And up
Right.
until last year, or if we go back to 2019, when Trump first floated the
Right.
idea of, back then it was buying Greenland, not taking over, as it looks like, it sounds
Right.
more like now. People just, I don't think any country would like someone coming in to steal territory.
Denmark just told Donald Trump to keep his hands off Greenland, and they didn't sugarcoat it. The message was sharp, unapologetic, and rooted in national pride. But the part no one in Washington seems to have noticed is this. While Denmark publicly shuts down Trump's Arctic ambitions, Canada is quietly becoming the Arctic power the U.S. can no longer overlook. Trump may be talking about Greenland again, but Canada is the country actually shaping the future of the North.
The story began when Trump revived one of his most bizarre foreign policy ideas, that the United States should take over or even acquire Greenland. It's a notion he first floated in 2019, and now, in his second term, he's bringing it back with even more confidence. The Danish response was immediate. A senior commentator, reflecting the public mood, said bluntly that Greenland is part of Denmark in the same way Hawaii or Alaska are part of the United States. Her exact words cut through the noise. No one wants someone coming in to steal territory. She also reminded viewers that the United States already has significant military presence in Greenland through the 1951 Defense Agreement, but only because Denmark allows it. In other words, Washington can deploy assets, but Copenhagen still holds the keys. Greenland, for its part, is an autonomous nation within the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own culture, its own government, and a long history of resisting any attempt, especially from superpowers, to dictate its future. So when Trump floated the idea of U.S. control again, both Denmark and Greenland pushed back immediately and forcefully.
One thing is clear. Trump's attempt to reassert U.S. dominance in the Arctic is running into the limits of U.S. influence. He may talk about Greenland as if it were real estate, but Denmark isn't selling, and Greenland isn't interested. The whole episode exposes a weakness in Trump's foreign policy approach. Allies don't appreciate being treated like properties, and sovereign nations push back when you try. What makes this moment even more damaging for Washington is that it arrives during a period of already strained alliances. Trump's tariff fights with Canada, tensions with Europe, and unpredictable diplomatic messaging have all contributed to a broader sense that the United States is no longer the steady hand it once was. While Trump creates friction, Canada is quietly building partnerships. Canada and Greenland resolved their last territorial disagreement, the Hans Island dispute, through peaceful negotiation in 2022, creating an atmosphere of trust between Ottawa and Nuuk. Since then, Canada has leaned into deeper cooperation, from climate research to Indigenous governance and Arctic transportation links. Ottawa is preparing to open a consulate in Nuuk, something no Canadian government had ever prioritized until now. This isn't symbolic. It reflects a long-term strategy. Canada wants a direct diplomatic presence in Greenland at a time when Greenland's leaders are actively looking for stable, respectful partners. Prime Minister Mark Carney's Arctic strategy is also accelerating. Canada is strengthening its satellite systems, upgrading northern defense infrastructure, and enhancing coastal surveillance, all while investing in local communities and respecting Indigenous leadership. Unlike the U.S. approach, Canada isn't trying to take over anything. It's building relationships, and those relationships are bearing fruit.
The world is paying attention to the Arctic in a way it hasn't before. Melting ice is opening new shipping routes. Russia is expanding its military footprint. China is positioning itself as a near-Arctic state as it funnels money into research stations and mineral projects. In this crowded landscape, Canada stands out for its combination of diplomacy, stability, and geography. Ottawa now controls the political tone of the North in ways nobody expected 5 years ago. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's effective.
What makes this shift even more significant is that Arctic alliances are no longer determined by military power alone. Nations are placing greater weight on environmental stewardship, indigenous partnership, and long-term resource governance. Canada's credibility in these areas gives it influence that sheer force cannot replicate. As the region warms and competition intensifies, countries are increasingly looking for partners who bring legitimacy and predictability, qualities Canada now projects more clearly than either Washington or Moscow. Denmark's decision to confront Trump is more than a bilateral disagreement. It shifts the balance of power in the Arctic. By shutting down Trump's Greenland talk so publicly, Denmark reinforces a fundamental truth. The United States doesn't automatically lead in the North anymore. And that opens an enormous opportunity for Canada. Unlike Trump's White House, Canada has treated Greenland with respect. It has emphasized cooperation, not control. And Greenland's leaders have responded positively because Canada's approach aligns with their own values, especially around climate resilience, education, and responsible development. The contrast is stark. Trump's approach raises suspicions. Canada's approach builds trust. That's how influence works in the Arctic today. This moment reveals a dramatic divide between two countries that share the world's longest border. Trump's America is increasingly confrontational, unpredictable, and focused on short-term victories. Carney's Canada is steady, pragmatic, and positioning itself as a long-term partner for northern nations. Canada is meeting NATO's defense target early, investing in new submarines and patrol vessels, and modernizing northern infrastructure from Nunavut to the Northwest Territories. These aren't symbolic gestures, they're signals that Canada intends to be a decisive Arctic power, not because it wants to dominate the region, but because it wants to shape it responsibly. As Denmark pushes back against U.S. overreach, Canada is quietly demonstrating the qualities Arctic nations value most: stability, respect, and consistency. And here's what's becoming increasingly clear. The Arctic is shifting toward a multipolar model where influence is earned through credibility, not coercion. Canada's ability to balance defense modernization with diplomacy gives it a unique advantage. While Washington wrestles with political turbulence, Ottawa is presenting a calm, coherent Arctic vision, one that resonates with governments from Copenhagen to Reykjavik, and, crucially, with leaders in Nuuk who are seeking predictable partners during a period of global tension. Denmark's blunt message to Trump, "Hands off Greenland," was more than a territorial stand. It was a statement about sovereignty, partnership, and the future of Arctic governance. For the first time in a long time, the United States isn't the dominant voice in the region. The vacuum is being filled not by aggression or ambition, but by diplomacy, and Canada is the country most ready to step into that role. The question now is whether Washington will recognize this shifting Arctic landscape, or whether Trump will continue pushing ideas that alienate allies and strengthen Canada's hand. Either way, the Arctic is changing, and this time, Canada is shaping the map.
This is really a catalytic moment for Canada and for our government, and I say that because we've got a Prime Minister who has brought the importance of the Arctic and sovereignty that is not recognized by countries like Russia and our friends, the United States.
I think it's about time Canada government need to focus on what are the beneficial for Canada. It's Arctic. It's that one particular area. This particular project is the one that could shovel ready in 2026.
Canada just made the boldest northern move in a generation. After decades of talking about Arctic sovereignty, decades of warning about foreign interest in the Northwest Passage, and decades of letting others develop while we stood still, Nunavut's Inuit leadership has stepped forward with something transformative: a fully permitted, community-backed deep-sea port at Qikiqtarjuaq that is ready to begin construction as early as spring 2026. At a moment when the United States is distracted by President Donald Trump's tariff battles, Russia is expanding its northern military infrastructure, and China is quietly investing across the circumpolar world, Canada is finally stepping into the arena, and it's doing so in the one place where presence is power, the Arctic. This port is not just an infrastructure project, it is Canada deciding, at long last, to take the North seriously. The recent press conference brought together Qikiqtaaluk Corporation, the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, and business leaders like John Risley to deliver a single, unmistakable message to Ottawa. The port is ready to go, and Canada needs to move with it. For more than 15 years, this project has been studied, reviewed, and analyzed. It has passed environmental assessments. It has earned full community approval. The location sits next to one of the richest turbot fishing grounds in the country. Yet, because Nunavut has no deep-water port, ships harvesting from Nunavut waters are forced to unload in Greenland or in far-off southern jurisdictions. Every trip that ends outside the territory drains at least $1 million in direct value, revenue that leaves the region before it ever has a chance to support local jobs or local development. The port site already has a 3,800-foot airstrip that can be extended into a tactical base. Defense officials have expressed interest because traffic in the Davis Strait is rising, and Canada lacks permanent infrastructure in the area. And with Northwest Passage shipping activity expected to increase over the next decade, Qikiqtarjuaq sits at the gateway of a corridor that global powers are watching very closely. The project's cost has risen to approximately $350 million for Phase 1, with just over $53 million already secured. But what matters most is this: the port is shovel-ready, fully permitted, and capable of beginning construction in the spring of 2026, provided Ottawa steps forward as a partner, whether through Coast Guard presence, defense tenancy, or national infrastructure funding. This moment is not a plea. It is a challenge to the federal government to finally match the ambition of the communities that live in the North. For years, Canada has watched other Arctic states build ports, runways, military bases, and research hubs, while we hesitated. Russia constructed an entire chain of northern ports. Norway equipped its far north region with modern deep-water facilities. China declared a polar Silk Road and made long-term investments in pre-Arctic logistics. Even the United States, despite its own slow pace, has at least moved forward on upgrading northern military infrastructure. Meanwhile, Canada mostly held press conferences. Nunavut's leaders captured the problem perfectly when they said Canada had nothing in the Arctic compared to its peers. This port is the moment the country stops being the silent Arctic nation, the one with the longest coastline but the least infrastructure, and starts being a real participant in northern geopolitics. Prime Minister Mark Carney has already signaled that the Arctic will become a central pillar of Canada's nation-building agenda. Reuters recently reported that his government plans to expand Arctic presence with new year-round operations and a long-term security commitment. Unlike previous administrations that focused on symbolic gestures, Carney views Arctic infrastructure as a structural investment, something permanent, something strategic, something that strengthens Canada for decades, not election cycles. The Qikiqtarjuaq port aligns perfectly with this new doctrine. It is Indigenous-led, it is economically sound, and it is geographically irreplaceable.
What makes this project even more powerful is who is leading it. This is not a Southern corporation imposing a project from outside. It is driven by Inuit organizations, Qikiqtaaluk Corporation and the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, who understand the land, the waters, and the long-term economic needs of the region. When northern communities take ownership, projects gain legitimacy. Environmental oversight is stronger, benefits stay in the region, and the work is grounded in stewardship rather than extraction. Canada's sovereignty is always strongest when Indigenous leadership is at the center. This port proves that point.
Right now, Nunavut's fishing industry produces enormous value, but almost all of that value leaves immediately because the territory has nowhere to unload, process, or ship catch. By forcing vessels to offload outside Nunavut, Canada effectively exports jobs, GDP, and tax revenue before it ever touches Inuit communities. A functioning deep-sea port changes everything. Fisheries can unload at home. Processing can happen in the region. Tourism can flourish with proper docking capacity. Marine services and shipping logistics can finally exist. For the first time, Nunavut can keep the wealth that comes from its own waters. This is economic sovereignty as much as geographic sovereignty.
The United States is not paying attention to the Arctic. Under Trump's second administration, Washington is consumed by tariff wars, legal challenges, and corporate pushback. Arctic infrastructure is nowhere near the top of America's priority list. That creates a rare strategic opening. Canada can build, quietly, decisively, while the U.S. is distracted. For once, Canadian sovereignty is not being overshadowed by American power. Instead, Canada is seizing the initiative. NATO has been demanding stronger Arctic infrastructure from Canada for years. A deep seaport capable of hosting Coast Guard vessels, naval ships, tactical aircraft, and search and rescue operations gives Canada exactly the credibility it has been missing. This project doesn't just strengthen northern communities, it strengthens Canada's standing in the alliance.
The most powerful part of this project is not the concrete or the cranes or the dollars. It is the shift in mindset. For too long, Canada treated the North as something distant, expensive, and symbolic. Now the country is treating it as the center of future strategy, economic, military, environmental, and national. This port is the first chapter of a new Arctic era.
The Qikiqtarjuaq Deep Sea Port is not a proposal. It is not a concept. It is a project ready to break ground in spring 2026. If Ottawa steps forward, Canada will enter the next decade not as a bystander in the Arctic, but as a builder, a leader, and a nation investing in its longest coastline. The countdown has started. Now the question is simple. Will Canada meet it?
China is clearly the leader. My own research, for example, shows that China generates automotive patents and have for the past decade at a rate of about 5 to 1 over the US. There's nothing about the US auto industry that suggests that it is going to be a global leader going forward.
Canada just crossed a line that almost no country has dared to cross in front of Donald Trump's political shadow, and it did so calmly, strategically, and with full confidence in its own future. While American automakers struggle under Trump's tariffs and collapsing production, Canada is openly debating something that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, pivoting toward China's ascendant electric vehicle industry and stepping away from the U.S. auto giants that once dictated the direction of this country. What makes this moment historic is not the shift itself, but the attitude behind it. Ottawa is no longer reacting out of fear or economic dependence. For the first time in decades, Canada sees the U.S. auto industry not as an anchor for stability, but as a risk, a sector falling behind in technology, supply chains, and global competitiveness. And that realization is sending shockwaves through Washington. The turning point began when Stellantis abruptly pulled its Jeep Compass production out of Brampton and moved it to the United States. Instead of silently accepting the decision, Ottawa launched a formal dispute resolution process, a rare and unusually assertive move that signals a new posture toward American automakers. In another era, Canada would have swallowed the loss, not this time. At the same moment, the U.S.-China trade war escalated to one of its most volatile phases in years. Washington's new tariffs on Chinese EVs and components pushed U.S. automakers into deeper instability. Reuters reported that production cuts across American plants reached levels as high as 20,000 vehicles per day, creating ripples throughout North American supply chains. Against this backdrop, Canada quietly reopened high-level diplomatic channels with Beijing. After Prime Minister Mark Carney met President Xi Jinping at APEC 2025, China restored Canada to its approved travel list and signaled openness to resolving long-standing disputes on canola and, crucially, on electric vehicles. At the same time, experts like Professor Greg Mordew of McMaster University began stating openly that China, not the United States, is now the global leader in automotive technology and patent production. His conclusion was blunt. If Canada wants a competitive automotive future, it must engage with the world's new center of innovation. That statement landed like a thunderclap in U.S. political circles.
And there's nothing about the U.S. industrial policy measures or the energy policy measures that suggest that continuing to try to tether our industry to the U.S. industry is the best bet.
For more than half a century, the U.S. enjoyed unquestioned dominance over the Canadian auto sector. But that dominance is cracking, not because Canada is turning away, but because the U.S. industry is losing its competitive edge. Under Trump's second-term tariff regime, supply chains have become unpredictable, costs have surged, and manufacturers across the U.S. have warned of significant production risks. Detroit, once the world's automotive powerhouse, is no longer setting the pace. Meanwhile, China is producing nearly 10 million electric vehicles annually, outpacing the US, Europe, and Japan combined. It files 5 times more automotive patents than the United States every single year. And while Washington pours billions into protectionism, Beijing pours billions into research, scale, and next-generation technology. Canada is watching this divergence closely, and the conclusion is becoming undeniable. The future of global automotive leadership is emerging in Asia, not America. What Canada is recognizing today is an economic truth that industry insiders have understood for a long time. The U.S. is no longer the world leader in cars, batteries, or electrification. North America's EV adoption is moving slower than Europe and dramatically slower than China. American automakers, facing tariff wars and political uncertainty, are cutting production, delaying EV investments, and shifting manufacturing strategies month by month. For Canada, this creates a dangerous dependency. If the U.S. continues to fall behind, Canada, historically tied to U.S. auto cycles, risks being dragged down with it. That's why Carney's government is reconsidering old assumptions and looking for partners who can actually support Canada's long-term industrial goals. Partnering with China does not mean embracing China politically. It means recognizing where the innovation is, where the engineering is advancing fastest, and where the automotive future is genuinely being built. This is not an ideological shift. It is a strategic one. No move threatens Trump more than the idea of Canada buying EVs from China instead of the United States. For decades, American automakers have relied on Canada as their stabilizing market, a guaranteed customer base that absorbed inventory and helped offset domestic downturns. But if Chinese EVs enter Canada at lower prices, with superior range, and with technology that U.S. automakers are still years away from matching, that entire model collapses. Such a shift would break the American monopoly overnight. It would lower vehicle prices across Canada, shift supply chains toward Asia, and undermine Trump's leverage in every trade negotiation. Trump has already floated the idea of 100% tariffs on Chinese imports, hoping to pressure Canada into resisting Chinese EVs. But the reality is that Canada is done letting Washington dictate what technologies it can or cannot adopt. The tariff chaos of 2025 made that perfectly clear. Trump broke the auto system that once sustained North America. Canada is now building something new.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has been consistent from the beginning. Canada will not chain its future to a declining industrial model. Instead, it will choose partnerships based on innovation, resilience, and Canadian national interest. By re-engaging with China, strengthening ties with Europe, and looking to ASEAN for growth, Canada is reshaping itself into a globally connected middle power, not an appendage of American industrial strategy. This is one of the first times a close U.S. ally has taken such an explicit step toward industrial independence. And ironically, it was Trump's own economic aggression that pushed Canada in this direction. Canada is no longer asking what Washington wants. It is asking what Canada needs. That shift in mindset is powerful. It is also irreversible.
Canada is not choosing China over the United States. It is choosing the future over the past. By exploring Chinese EV partnerships, challenging Stellantis, and refusing to let Trump dictate the terms of North American manufacturing, Canada is stepping into a new era of sovereignty, confident, self-directed, and globally engaged. The real question now is how far this pivot will go. Will Canada open the door fully to Chinese EVs and break a century-long dependency on Detroit? Will Trump escalate further? Or will the U.S. finally confront its own industrial stagnation? And above all, is this the moment Canada begins building an automotive future defined not by American expectations, but by Canadian ambition?
In September, we announced the first tranche of these projects that we referred to the Major Projects Office for accelerated deployment. On top of that list is the new Darlington nuclear project. Canada's new government is putting forward $2 billion to build new clean energy technology, the first of its kind in Canada.
Canada is on its way to becoming an energy superpower, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. East of Toronto, at the Darlington nuclear site, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford stood side by side to announce what they called a turning point in Canada's industrial story. The two leaders unveiled a massive plan, 4 new small modular reactors, or SMRs, backed by $2 billion from the federal government and another $1 billion from Ontario's Building Ontario Fund. The Darlington project will be the first of its kind in the G7 and Canada's boldest step yet into next-generation nuclear power. By placing it in the major projects category, Ottawa and Queen's Park can speed up regulatory approvals and construction, trimming years off the normal process. What looks like a regional energy project is, in reality, a national industrial strategy. It is designed to protect Canadian supply chains, secure energy independence, and rebuild high-value jobs that have been squeezed by America's aggressive trade policy. While Washington leans on tariffs to pull production south, Canada is betting on reactors to keep its industries alive at home. The Darlington SMR plan marks the start of a new era for Canadian energy. The reactors will use GE Hitachi's BWRX-300 technology, a compact modular design that produces about 300 megawatts each, roughly one-third the output of a conventional nuclear plant, but built at a fraction of the cost and time. The site east of Toronto is already being prepared by Ontario Power Generation, OPG, which operates the existing Darlington station. According to OPG's project filings in 2025, construction will support as many as 18,000 jobs across Ontario and generate around $500 million in local economic activity every year once the 4 units are running. For Carney and Ford, this is not just about electricity, it is about building an industrial base that can resist external shocks. Nuclear energy provides stable, emission-free power that manufacturers, data centers, and transport networks will depend on for decades. Carney called it a foundation for Canada's next industrial century, emphasizing that homegrown energy is key to long-term competitiveness. By declaring the reactors a major project, Ottawa cut the average approval time by nearly 40%, allowing groundwork to start immediately. The move signals a shift from bureaucracy to execution, a practical, business-like approach to nation-building. For Ford, whose province remains Canada's manufacturing hub, the stakes are high. Ontario's economy has lost thousands of auto and steel jobs as global supply chains shifted under U.S. tariffs. The SMR investment promises to restore confidence that Ontario can once again anchor heavy industry with reliable, affordable power made in Canada.
Canada's first SMR is being built east of Toronto with plans in place to build 3 more units at that same site, and it could serve as a blueprint for Alberta.
The impact of Darlington's announcement didn't stop at Ontario's borders. It sparked a wave of interest across the country, and Alberta was quick to answer. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith revealed that her province would begin public consultations on adding nuclear power to its energy mix. Alberta has long depended on natural gas to supply electricity, but the Premier said small, modular reactors could offer a cleaner and more reliable base load, especially for the province's massive oil sands operations. The model she pointed to was Darlington. The 4 SMRs being built east of Toronto are now the blueprint for Canada's nuclear future, a modular system that can be replicated province by province. Smith noted that SMRs can be prefabricated and shipped to site, cutting both costs and construction risk. The technology's scalability is what makes it attractive. Each 300-megawatt reactor can power roughly 300,000 homes, and multiple units can be combined for larger grids. For Alberta, this isn't just an energy decision, it's an industrial one. The province aims to attract nuclear-related manufacturing, engineering, and maintenance jobs, the kind that sustain long-term regional growth. By aligning with Ontario's lead, Alberta joins a growing national shift toward nuclear collaboration, signaling that Canada's path to energy independence is no longer an Ontario story, but a pan-Canadian transformation. Together, the two provinces represent opposite poles of the country's energy landscape, one rooted in manufacturing, the other in hydrocarbons, now united by a common goal: to make Canada self-reliant in power generation and industrial security.
South of the border, the news from Ontario came as a surprise. The Trump administration has spent 2025 doubling down on tariffs that were meant to pull investment back to American soil. By targeting Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos with 25% duties, Washington hoped to weaken its northern neighbor's competitiveness. But instead of retreating, Canada moved in the opposite direction. Tariffs that were meant to hurt have forced Canada to reinvent itself. The Darlington SMR Plan is the clearest example of that. A project born from pressure, financed through national funds, and built entirely within Canada's borders. Economists at PwC Canada noted in September 2025 that federal energy investments now account for over 3% of GDP, the highest in 2 decades. Much of this growth is driven by infrastructure spending linked to the nuclear sector. In other words, Trump's economic squeeze has pushed Canada to re-industrialize faster than expected. The irony is hard to ignore. As U.S. companies lobby for tax breaks to offset rising import costs, Canadian firms are finding stability in government-backed energy and construction contracts. While Trump's tariffs raised prices in American factories, they also made Canada's domestic production more attractive to global investors seeking predictable energy costs. The political contrast is striking. Trump's strategy relies on confrontation. Carney's relies on capacity. One weaponizes tariffs, the other builds reactors. The outcome is clear. As the U.S. turns inward, Canada is scaling up.
From Darlington to Alberta, a pattern is emerging. Canada is transforming from a supplier of raw materials to a producer of advanced energy infrastructure. Nuclear power, once a cautious experiment, has become a central pillar of the country's economic identity. The numbers tell the story. According to Ontario Power Generation's 2025 update, every billion US dollars invested in SMR development supports roughly 6,000 direct and indirect jobs. The Darlington cluster alone could generate over $2 billion in tax revenue over the next decade. These figures are driving new training programs, research partnerships, and supply chain investments across the country. The Alberta consultations show that momentum is spreading. Provinces are no longer waiting for federal incentives. They are competing to host the next wave of nuclear manufacturing. For the United States, this shift carries strategic consequences. By insulating its economy with tariffs, Washington may have triggered a new competitor next door, one that combines clean energy leadership with industrial stability. Canada's nuclear build-out gives it something every modern economy craves: dependable, affordable power in a volatile world. What began as a $3 billion investment east of Toronto is now a national mission. Factories, universities, and provincial governments are aligning around the same idea: that Canada's strength lies not in chasing America's policies, but in charting its own. In that sense, the reactors rising at Darlington are more than concrete and steel. They are a declaration of independence. Trump wanted to make America dominant again, but in doing so, he may have created his toughest rival yet, an energy superpower being built quietly just across the border.